Hello and welcome to another TLDR global video. If you've been skimming the news recently, you'll probably know that there was a military coup in Myanmar in February. A military junta took control of the country following what they called a fraudulent election, and although the international community says there's no proof of this, they decided to oust their country's elected leaders. Anyway, despite this happening over a month ago, tensions haven't cooled, with protests getting increasingly violent and protesters seemingly undeterred by the military's violence and killings. We've discussed this topic briefly a number of times in the Global Summary, our weekly rundown of the biggest news events that you might have missed. But we asked you if you wanted a deeper dive, and the response was resounding. So let's discuss what's going on. Oh, and by the way, make sure to subscribe if you want to see all of our videos, including the Global Summary, and help shape the topics we choose. Myanmar, or Burma as it was officially known until 1989, has been under some form of military rule for most of its lifetime, since it became independent from Britain in 1948. It was a democracy from 1948 to 1958, when the democratically elected then-president, U Nu, asked the military to help facilitate the 1960 general election. Nu won the 1960 election, but the military now had a taste for power, and staged a coup in 1962. For the next 26 years, until 1988, Burma was ruled by a military junta led by General Ne Win. In this time, Burma became one of the world's poorest countries. Compared to its geographical neighbours, Burma's economy did appallingly badly. So in 1988, after massive protests known as the 8888 Uprising, General Saw Wang overthrew General Ne Win and promised new elections. To mark this change, in 1989, the military renamed Burma Myanmar, and in 1990, they held Myanmar's first elections since 1960. In these elections, the General League for Democracy, otherwise known as the NLD, won a massive majority, with 392 of the 492 seats available, and 58.7% of the popular vote. The NLD was led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Suu Kyi had become somewhat of a national icon during the 8888 uprising, where she protested for democracy. She's also the only daughter of Aung San, the man who negotiated Burma's independence from Britain in 1948. Aung San is widely considered the father of the nation of Burma, which obviously helped with his daughter's popularity. Unfortunately though, the military junta's preferred party, the National Unity Party, won only 10 seats and 21% of the vote. However, the military junta decided they didn't feel like handing over power, so Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest under a law which allowed for arbitrary detention of up to 3 years without charge. From 1989 to 2010, Suu Kyi spent about 16 years under house arrest. The UN declared this a contravention of Article 9 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and in 1991, Suu Kyi won the Nobel Peace Prize for her commitment to democracy. Anyway, the point is that the military largely ignored this election, took back control, and placed Suu Kyi under house arrest. The junta then stayed in power until 2010, when another general election was held. During this time, there were 2 assassination attempts on Suu Kyi by military or pro-military auxiliaries. In 1996, 200 members of the Union Solidarity and Development Association, a political party backed by the military, attacked Suu Kyi's motorcade. In 2003, as many as 5,000 pro-military militiamen blocked a convoy full of NLD members, including Suu Kyi. Suu Kyi escaped, but about 70 NLD members were killed. Anyway, before the 2010 general election, the military held a referendum on a new constitution for Myanmar, which would dictate the terms of the general election. According to the new constitution, the military would get to appoint a quarter of all seats in parliament, effectively giving them a veto over any constitutional change. The military would also keep control of the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Defence. Finally, the constitution prevented anyone with foreign relatives from becoming president. This was squarely aimed at Suu Kyi, whose deceased husband and 2 sons are British. The referendum on the constitution was ultimately a bit of a sham. Opposition was suppressed, and the final result was apparently 94% support for the constitution, even though exit polls estimated only 60% support. Ultimately, even the United States passed condemnation of Myanmar's constitution and referendum, backing claims that the whole thing wasn't democratic. As a result, the NLD boycotted the 2010 elections, both because the constitution wasn't democratic and because Suu Kyi wasn't allowed to run because she had a criminal record thanks to a bizarre incident where an American man swam up to her house in order to warn her about an impending terrorist attack that had been divinely revealed to him, which apparently was illegal. Without the NLD competing, the military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party, or USDP, won a majority in both houses. Although it's worth saying that the UN expressed doubts about the fairness of the election, and Obama claimed that the election didn't meet internationally recognized standards. Anyway, the next election was held in 2015. The NLD ran this time, led by Suu Kyi, and who won resoundingly, with a majority in both houses. However, because of the new constitution, Suu Kyi couldn't become president, so the government created a new role for her as state councillor, and she became de facto leader of the country. And finally, we get to the 2020 elections. These were held in November last year, and again, Suu Kyi and the NLD won resoundingly, increasing their majority in both houses. On the other hand, the USDP won fewer seats than in 2015. In the immediate aftermath of the election, the military claimed that the election had been fraudulent, and that they discovered 8 million voting irregularities. Myanmar's election commission said that the army's claims were baseless, and while they probably were, the election was dodgy for another reason. That's because voting was cancelled for an estimated 1.5 million voters, mainly in the region of Rakhine, apparently because of security concerns. Now, there is interethnic violence in the region, but somewhat suspiciously, the NLD cancelled voting in constituencies it lost to the Arkan National Party in 2015, but kept voting open in the constituencies it won. This is certainly dodgy, but while it would suppress the ANP's vote, it shouldn't have affected the USDP's. Anyway, the military demanded a rerun with military observation. The NLD said no, and then on February 1st, the day before new members of parliament were supposed to be sworn in, the military staged a coup, declared a one-year state of emergency, and detained Suu Kyi. Ultimately, the point is that the military never really gave up power in Myanmar. Even though it looked like a democracy with elections every 5 years, the military were always there. They had a quarter of seats in parliament, an effective veto in many cases, and control over important ministries. Also, the military is, in relative terms, huge. Myanmar's military has more than 549,000 active personnel, and defence expenditures totalling 13 to 14% of the national budget, about 6 times the global average. So while the coup is still big news, in a way it's just the military making more explicit what was already implicit. That in the end, they're the ones with the power, and they're not going to give it up easily. In the last month though, there's been intermittent protests against the military, which have really stepped up in recent days and weeks. The UN estimates that 54 people have been killed, mainly during protests on February 28th and March 3rd, when at least 38 people were killed and 1,700 people detained, including at least 29 journalists. Soldiers have even been filmed shooting unarmed protesters and beating volunteer medics. The military junta is also drafting a new cybersecurity bill, which will give it unlimited power to intercept data and imprison people for spreading false information. There's speculation that the overnight internet blackouts that have been happening since February 15th are happening because the government's installing new hardware that will allow them to better monitor user data. As for Suu Kyi, she's still under arrest, but she did appear at a court hearing last week via video link, and apparently seemed to be in good health. So what happens now then? Well, the junta's leader has pledged to hold new elections, but the protests are getting increasingly violent. If the military can weather the protests, then Myanmar will likely return to pseudo-democratic elections overseen by the military. If, on the other hand, the protests somehow succeed, then Myanmar might have a shot at becoming a real democracy. Given the electoral success and popularity of Suu Kyi's NLD, it seems fair to assume that this is something a majority of Myanmar's population wants to see happen. Whether it will or not, well, only time will tell. If you want to be updated on this story as it continues to play out, then subscribe to the channel and make sure you're watching the global summary each week. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.